And speaking of streaming TV, I was very pleased with the trailer they just released for Star Trek Picard. It looks like an awesome continuation of the Jean-Luc Picard story without going back to making it just into another Star Trek show. Now, of course, we haven't seen much, about 2 or 3 minutes of it, but there was enough there that I think really satisfied the fans. And I think they are going to be successful here in creating a new story with familiar characters. I kind of liken this actually to what I've been seeing with Cobra Kai on YouTube, where you've got the beloved characters from the original Karate Kid movie, but you've moved them into the future. They're not replicating the past, and it's a whole new story with characters that you're familiar with. And I think that's what they're doing here. But the bigger thing they've done here is had Patrick Stewart sitting in the writer's room the entire time as they've been putting these stories together. So he's not only the lead actor, but he's also kind of the lead consultant and actually probably a writer. I think he's got producer credits on it as well. He's very much invested in this, and I think he's very tuned in to what the fans are looking for. And he's been channeling the fans' energy as they've been creating this show and writing the scripts out for it. And I think that's what you have to do with a beloved franchise like this, especially when you want to have the original characters come back. And I think if you look at what the Star Wars franchise did with The Last Jedi, if they had involved Mark Hamill in the writing process the way they're involving Patrick Stewart in the writing of this series, I think that movie probably would have been better received. And what's funny is that I kind of liked The Last Jedi, but I didn't like what they did with Luke Skywalker. And my opinion of liking the movie apparently is not a popular one among Star Wars fans, but I always looked at it from the perspective of, hey, this is not mine, it's theirs, and they can do whatever they want with it. But I did not like what they did with Luke, and I think if Mark Hamill had been involved a little bit more with it, perhaps it would have gone in a different and better direction. It looks like they're not making that mistake here with Jean-Luc Picard and really giving him, the actor, as much of a role in creating this series to ensure that the fans' voices are heard. And I think to some degree, when you're talking about Star Trek or Star Wars or even some of the Marvel Comics stuff, the fans do really have some ownership of it and perhaps need better representation as these stories are being put together. And I think this is going to be a great example of that in action. We'll have to see what happens when the show airs next year. So I think we're entering into a real golden era of all of these great sci-fi shows. These are 6 that I'm really interested in, including Star Trek Discovery, which I really have been enjoying. Season 2 I thought was great. The Orville really turned into a great alternative to some of the current Star Trek offerings for those that weren't into that. I've been a big fan of that show too. I'm excited for The Mandalorian, which is a new Star Wars show coming to the Disney Plus network. We've got Picard. There's another Star Trek show coming to CBS All Access called Lower Decks, and then you've got The Expanse. All of these super high budget shows, great writing, great acting, awesome special effects, and very expensive to put these things together. And that is why I think subscriptions, at least for this kind of content, are the future. You just can't make enough money putting these kinds of shows on free TV where the audiences are generally limited for them. But there's enough of that audience for subscription services to actually make them work. And apparently this is the result of it. We have never had this much great sci-fi on at once, and now we do. And I am very excited for that because I got stuff to watch, and there's a good chance this stuff isn't going away after a season like it often does on traditional networks. And again, there's a price for that, but I think it's working, at least for those of us who like this kind of content. And I got bad news for those of you who like the Orville as I do, because it is also moving away from Fox and going to Hulu for season 3. And I thought the ratings on the Orville were really good, and they may have been, so it could just be that Hulu outbid Fox for the show, because the show is sold to Fox for production, or it just could be that Fox doesn't see them making as much money in that time slot versus something that might appeal to a wider audience. And of course, the networks now have much smaller audiences than they used to, and they depend on advertising to fund all of the programming that they do. Now on Hulu, it won't be as much of an issue to keep the Orville going. And if you want to watch the Orville now, you got to have the Hulu subscriptions, so just be ready for that. Now, if you're curious as to how these shows are actually doing, it's really hard to figure out because none of these streaming platforms report ratings. Sometimes you might hear Netflix saying, hey, we got X number of viewers for this show, but we don't really have the Nielsen equivalent here because most of these streaming platforms are not relying on advertising and therefore don't have to disclose viewership to anyone. And as a result of this, you have to come up with different ways of measurement. And there's a firm out there called Parrot, and they have developed something they call the average daily demand expression. And this is done through looking at what people are talking about on social media platforms and YouTube critic reviews, that sort of thing. But they're also looking at file sharing platforms. In other words, how much is this content being pirated in addition to it being watched perhaps legally? And they come up with a number and then have a ranking system for determining how shows are doing. And check this out. January through March 2019, here in the US, they listed Stranger Things, of course, top of the heap. And that, I think, was before the new season even started. So there's a sci-fi show. You got the Titans here, number 2, on the DC Universe streaming platform. I hadn't even heard of that, but apparently it is number 2 on that demand scale. Star Trek Discovery, another sci-fi show, is number 3. And you can see a number of other sci-fi shows making the list here. Many of them from the DC Universe, and Star Trek, of course, being the only one from CBS All Access to make the cut here. So clearly there is demand on streaming, and there's enough money to be made on streaming for this stuff, but there's not enough on network, and that's why we're all being pushed into these platforms, because you can finally get what you want, because they can corral enough of us together to make something profitable if we all pay for it. And it looks like those efforts are starting to bear some fruit. And I'm actually in the process now of looking at my entire entertainment budget and reallocating that budget to some of these streaming services to accommodate the things that I want to watch. And I'll probably be scaling back my cable subscription as a result. I'll let you know what I end up doing as we get a little further into the year here. And this aversion to science fiction is nothing new for the big networks. I found this article from the Los Angeles Times from May of 1988 about how successful Star Trek The Next Generation was as a first-run syndicated show. They tried to sell it to the major networks. None of them wanted it. So what Paramount did at the time was they offered the show for free to a number of stations throughout the country that were independently owned. Those stations, of course, jumped on that opportunity because they were already airing reruns of the original Star Trek. They only had to put up a couple of minutes of advertising that Paramount would shoot down with those shows when they were provided to the channel, but the channel could air it whenever they wanted and then run 5 minutes of their own commercials throughout the course of the broadcast. It was a win-win, and that's why Star Trek The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Voyager to a degree all were able to stay on the air for as long as they did, because they bypassed this traditional network thing. But nowadays, most TV stations are owned by large conglomerates that in some cases are almost as big as the big TV networks are themselves. And it's a lot harder to make this model work for free TV in 2019 as it was in 1988. And I think, again, this is pushing everyone over to the subscription model and why we won't see a lot of free stuff on network TV.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold-level supporters, the Four Guys with Quarters podcast, emudev.org, Tom Albrecht, Brian Parker, and Kalyan Kumar. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to lon.tv/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit lon.tv/s.